Good afternoon. My name is Lex Heerma van Voss. The guest of honor is on my right, Marcus Rediker. He'll speak in English, so I'll speak in English too, although you already know that's not my natural habit. But it makes more sense so Marcus can check what I'm telling about him to do this in English too. Marcus is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. He is known really globally for historical work that has a few recognizable traits. All of his work... Sorry? Bedankt. All of his works are histories from below. They deal with ordinary people, and more specifically with Atlantic sailors, slaves and pirates, whom he finds are a rather international crowd, which often act in solidarity with each other and in revolutionary ways. The books that have made him famous have titles like The Many-Headed Hydra, Villains of All Nations, Outlaws of the Atlantic, The Amistad Rebellion. He also writes about other 18th century revolutionaries, more specifically the Quaker dwarf Benjamin Lay. And his chosen medium is not just ordinary books. He has co-produced a film, Ghost of Amistad, co-written a play, The Return of Benjamin Lay, and 2 of his books have been turned into graphic novels. Tonight, we are here to talk about his book, The Slave Ship, A Human History, which, when it was first published in 2007, won the next year 3 major American prizes for historical publications, which I'll spare you the titles of to give all the more time to Marcus Rediker.
Thank you, Lex. Thanks to all of you for coming this evening. I'd like to begin by thanking Caitlin and Isis, who organized this event. I'd like to thank Arthur Presterink of Spectrum Publishers, my dear friend Lex, another friend Pepijn Brandon, who is not able to be here, who made possible the Dutch edition of this book. This book. And I also want to give special recognition to my translator, Rob de Ridder. Rob, can you show people who you are? Okay, now, I personally think that translators don't give enough help, don't get enough credit. And I would mention here a story told by Pablo Neruda, who was sitting in a room of translators who were working on a poem of his. And after one of the translators said something, Pablo Neruda jumped to his feet and said, "That's much better than what I wrote." And Rob, I don't doubt that there are passages in the slave ship that are much better than what I wrote. And I thank you for your important work. Okay, so let's talk about the Atlantic slave trade. It's a tough subject. As people here in the Netherlands know, as people throughout Europe know, as people in the United States know, it's a topic that has been surrounded by denial for a long time. I won't go into all the details, but I'll just mention that when I first wrote this book, I got a lot of hate mail from people who were very angry that this subject had been broached in the way that I wrote about it. I am aware of the debate in the Netherlands. I cannot follow it very closely because I don't read Dutch, but I think it is well known that there were 1,500 voyages carried out on Dutch vessels. The Dutch operated 10 fortresses on the West African coast. somewhere between 550 and 600,000 souls were delivered to the Americas in Dutch ships. Now, I just would like to remind you that back in the 17th and the 18th century, you were all known as the sea dogs of Europe. And you know what that means? That means that a lot of Dutch history happened overseas. And sometimes that history comes back home. And sometimes when it does, it makes your football team better. But it also means that it raises really serious questions about what is justice in the aftermath of slavery. So I want to talk to you about some of the conclusions that I arrived at in writing The Slave Ship. To put it very simply, my view is that the slave trade is one of the most important events in all of human history. It is crucial to the origins and the rise of capitalism, to imperialism, to colonial systems worldwide. And I'd quote here the great African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who had this to say, and I think this is in the introduction to my book. I think this is one of the most poetic statements anyone has ever made about the slave trade. Du Bois wrote, "The most magnificent drama in the last 1,000 years of human history is the transportation of 10 million people out of the dark beauty of their mother continent into the newfound El Dorado of the West." Those people, said Du Bois, descended into hell. Now, I'm sure you all know, but El Dorado was the mythic city of gold that colonizers were always trying to find. The conquistadores, for example, they finally found it in the slave trade, in the plantation system that ensued. The slave trade and slavery, the entire slave system that it created, was fundamentally premised on violence and terror. Violence, or the threat of violence, was present at every step, from the capture of peoples in West Africa, into the forts and the factories, onto the ships, onto the land of the New World slave societies. Violence and terror were defining features of this experience. And I think if anything has been proven in the writing of American history over the past 50 years, it's that the slave trade and slavery are absolutely central to the American experience. There is no denying that anymore. I think we're increasingly discovering how important it is to Dutch history, British history, French history, Portuguese history, Spanish history. It's just extremely important. Now, this lecture that I'm going to give is not going to be easy, because in my view, what we need to do in understanding the slave trade is to comprehend it in human terms. That means descending into the hell that Du Bois described. That means understanding that the ship was an instrument of terror. These are hard truths, and they have been avoided for a very long time. Now, in this post-9/11 world that we live in, we talk about terror all the time, do we not? I mean, for many years after 9/11, terror was on the front page of every American newspaper and the lead story in almost every American evening news program. But the question I want to pose is, what do we do and say about the terror that was instrumental to building the power and the wealth of Western societies? Do we have the courage to talk about that kind of terror? Because they had enormous consequences. And I do think that it is the real test of any democratic society to face these dark pages of their history. It's easy to talk about the glorious parts. You know, the ideas of the American Revolution, for example, in the case of the United States, all that great high-flown rhetoric about liberty, that's easy to talk about. Can you talk about the other stuff, the violence? Now, I also want to submit to you that any hope we have of overcoming the legacy of slavery depends entirely on historical memory. In other words, we need to come to grips with this history. We need to repair the damage of this history. Reparations are necessary, I concluded in writing this book. And that's all because, in my view, these slave ships are still sailing. They're still there. We still live with the consequences of them every day of our lives. We may put a lot of energy into denying that that's true. But true, I think it certainly is. So I want to talk to you today about three things. I want to give a portrait of the Atlantic slave trade, kind of an overview. I want to talk about the slave ship as a human experience. That's my second major theme. And then I want to talk about how enslaved Africans responded to this ugly reality. I think we have a lot to learn from how they responded. Okay. So let's talk about the trade itself. The first point is that we know a lot about it. And the reasons are pretty simple. This was big, big business. And it generated massive amounts of documentation. Lloyd's of London, one of the great maritime brokers of insurance, they still won't open their archives to researchers. But despite that, so much is known. It's crucial. Okay, so let's start with the tall ship. Okay, this is actually a Danish ship from 1788. I submit to you that this kind of ship, this European tall ship, is the most important technology in the rise of global capitalism. That in fact, you cannot conceive of a world market without it. It's a machine. It's a very sophisticated machine for its day. People who had never seen it were terrified by it when it showed up on their shores. One Spanish priest talked about arriving on the coast of West Africa and firing the cannon, the big cannon that were on these kinds of vessels. You can see the cannon ports. He said the experience was enough to make people worship Jesus Christ. So this gunned warship, this floating machine of great destructive speed and power, is at the heart of this story. And I dare say some of you probably know that can you tell this is a slave ship? Yeah. There are several telltale signs. The three funnels, those are to capture air and funnel it down to the lower deck. I'd also mention, you see just above the waterline on the vessel, there are airports carved into the side of the ship. Believe me, you don't carve holes in the side of the ship near the waterline unless there are breathing creatures in there that need air. And then one more thing I would draw your attention to. Do you see just above the rails of the ship, there's netting? Netting. Netting was put up by slave ship captains to prevent the Africans from jumping overboard and committing suicide. Because they believed, many, I think almost all West African cultures held the belief that if you died under strange circumstances in a place like this, your body would go home, to go back to Guinea, as they said. So slave ship captains had to wage a constant war to keep these Africans alive so that their bodies could be sold and profits could be made. So this is a slave ship. Now, there is this romance of the tall ship, right? I'm sure all of you have seen them. They're quite majestic and beautiful. And people love them all, but this expresses the limit. This is the one that we don't want to talk about. And it may be the most important of all those tall ships. Okay, so Portugal led the way. Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, France, England, the United States, all engage in this mad rush for black gold. And we now have something called the Trans-Atlantic Slave Trade Database, which I would recommend to all of you. This charts 36,000 voyages from roughly 1500 to around 1870. And so here's one fact we see right away. The slave trade went on for almost 400 years. This is a remarkable thing about it, because most incidents of great, intense human violence last a much shorter period of time. We think of the murderous effort to exterminate the Jews over 6 years, 6 million killed. The slave trade went on almost 400 years. Why did it go on for 400 years? That is a simple question to answer. Because it produced great profits. So in some ways, this story in this book is all about what people are willing to do to each other for money. That's one of the things we need to talk about. Here's an important map that it draws on the data of the Trans-Atlantic Slave Trade Database. And what you can see is the different sources from Senegambia in the north, down along the coast, Sierra Leone, Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra. And then the single greatest source of enslaved people was West Central Africa, areas known as Congo and Angola. And you can see in this map where they went. Most of them went to the Caribbean. The Dutch carried a lot of people to the Caribbean, as did the British. The second greatest recipient, and as this research develops, it might prove to be that the single greatest recipient was Brazil. Okay? A relatively small number went to North America, but don't be deceived by that. The American slave system will grow to be one of the most powerful under different demographic circumstances. The current estimates are that roughly 12 million people were loaded onto these vessels. Roughly 10 million of them were delivered alive. And you will notice the difference between those two numbers. Roughly 2 million, maybe more, died. And every morning, the sailors would go below to the lower deck and bring up the corpses of the dead and unceremoniously throw them into the Atlantic Ocean. Those bodies would be consumed by sharks who trailed the vessels all the way across the Atlantic. This was a grisly truth. I actually, abolitionists made a lot of the sharks, and I decided to look into it. So I spoke with shark specialists, ichthyologists. Very easy to train a shark to a source of food. Slave ship captains used sharks as part of the regime of terror. But don't think that this difference between 12 million loaded and 10 million delivered is the full extent of death in the slave trade. It's vastly greater than that. If we go back and look at the full process of enslavement, starting with the wars in West Africa, between usually different African nations or ethnicities, to feed the hunger of the European slave traders, people who died in those wars, people who died on the long march from the interior to the coast. As the slave trade developed over time, the catchment area of human beings moved further and further into the interior as the coastal areas were exhausted of people. People are marched to the coast. Many die along the way. They're taken to barracoons and factories and fortresses, and many people died in those places before ever going on board a ship. Many died, as I've said, on the Middle Passage, and then another large number died upon arrival in the New World. Many people were very sick when they arrived. I'd say it's probably another 4 or 5 million. We can't really know the exact number because we don't have documents about the dead in these wars in the interior of West Africa. But we're looking at many millions dead. Now, the result of all this, the result of this war of attrition in which many would die, and believe me, European merchants accepted that it would be fine for a certain number of people to die as long as they could sell the others. What happened over time is that the slave ship and the plantation system that it made possible became the foundations of Atlantic capitalism for quite a while, and in many ways drove the Atlantic economy. The great West Indian scholar activist C.L.R. James had this to say: this plantation system, the whole Atlantic system that we're talking about here, was the greatest planned accumulation of wealth the world had seen up to that time. The factory system will eventually outdo it. And there are connections between the two, as Eric Williams said long ago. So, El Dorado had been found. I just can't overemphasize the importance of wealth, the wealth that is generated by this hideous trade. Okay, so we know a lot about the numbers. And this is really important to know. Very important that we know the numbers. How many people, how many died? The number who died, roughly 12% of all voyages over the full almost 4 centuries. About 1 in 8 died and was flung over the side of the ship. But one of the purposes of my book was to write against what I called the violence of abstraction. The violence of abstraction. In other words, too much of the history, in my view, reduced human beings to statistics. Reduced them, in a sense, actually dissolved them into statistics. And in the process, sanitized the history. And one of my strongest beliefs in writing this book is that we needed to understand the slave trade as a human experience in order to grapple with its moral depravity. The statistics can help you to do that, but they are radically insufficient. So let's talk now about the slave trade as a human experience. And folks, this is challenging. This is hard. This is hard to do, because the conditions on these slave ships are very nearly undescribable. I mean, the horror is almost unimaginable. And yet we have to try to do it. So let me ask you to try to imagine the pain and demoralization of 300 people. That's the average number of enslaved people loaded onto the average European tall ship. 300 people. They were usually made up of 10 to 15 to 20 different nationalities, ethnicities, or language groups. The slave traders would go down the coast, picking up small numbers at different places in order to mix up the language groups so that people could not cooperate with each other and rise up in resistance. That kind of language mixing. And it's also important to know that some of these people who found themselves on these same ships were mortal enemies of each other. They had been waging war against each other for a long time. Traditional enemies, competing over land, labor, resources. And suddenly they're thrown together in the lower deck of a slave ship, where they begin to discover that they have bigger problems than each other. So they begin to cooperate. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. So I've already mentioned the long march from the interior to the coast and human trains that were called coffles, all the way to the interior of the ship. Death is already well known by all of the captives by the time they get to the ship. Then there is a degrading and humiliating experience of inspection and purchase, in which doctors and slave ship captains want to inspect the bodies of men, women, and children to make sure that they are healthy and are going to be productive workers on these plantations in the New World. They are literally crowded into these slave ships in a way that is really hard for us to understand. But let's try. Okay, this is a famous image. I'm sure all of you have seen it. It's on the cover of my book. This is a real ship. It's called the Brooks, sailed out of Liverpool. And this can help us to understand what the experience was like on board a slave ship. And I should mention that abolitionists actually went on board the Brooks and took all of its measurements. So this is drawn to scale, probably by a naval architect. It's a real ship. It was actually, many people think that this was drawn by slave traders. It wasn't. It was drawn, first of all, by a group of abolitionists in Plymouth, England, to create a document for the movement to abolish the slave trade that would make real to people what the human reality on board these ships was actually like. Okay, so this is actually propaganda. And it's one of the most powerful pieces of propaganda that any social movement has ever created, because it captures a deep part of reality. Here is how you imagine what's going on these slave ships. William Wilberforce, one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement, but in my view, given way too much credit, did have one very powerful thing to say when he said, "Never has so much human suffering been confined to so small a space as on a slave ship." And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, the Brooks was around 100 feet in length. It's not very long, is it? About 25 feet in width. And if you look up at the top left where you see the bodies, you sort of see the sectioning of the ship. We know exactly what was the distance between decks, between the lower deck and the main deck above. Was about 5 feet 6 inches. And you'll also notice, if you see the second image here, where people are in this kind of oblong semicircle, you'd have to superimpose that on the lower image because platforms were built in the slave ships in order to get more people into the lower deck. So that means, if you look up at the top, if you were either on a platform or beneath a platform, you had about 2 feet 8 inches of headroom. Okay? Think about that. You couldn't even sit up properly. Now, there are in this image 482 men, women, and children. I've counted them. But what you would need to know, and this is kind of shocking, this is the number of people the Brooks was allowed to carry after humanitarian legislation was passed in 1788, something called the Dolben Act, which limited the number of people who could be carried by the tonnage of the vessel. Okay? So the 482 you see right there, we have evidence of other voyages of the Brooks in which 609 people went on board. And another voyage of 638 people. And then the most mind-boggling of all, there was one voyage on which the Brooks carried 740 people. Now, I ask you, where are you going to put them? You're literally going to pile bodies on top of bodies. The idea being that some of them will die, but we'll make more money when we get to Jamaica or Brazil or Virginia or wherever it is we're going. Now, I want you to also think about this crowding of humanity in terms of heat. These voyages are taking place in the tropics, most of them. It's unbelievably hot. I would ask you to think about oxygen, the problems of breathing. There are stories of enslaved people coming to the lattice work on the main deck and grabbing one of the rails and pulling themselves up to get a breath of fresh air. Whereupon the captain would take his cat-o'-nine tails and drive those people back down below because they were blocking the air for everybody else. There are cases where people died of asphyxiation. I want you to imagine what this kind of place was like when people first set to sea and got seasickness, as many did, throwing up everywhere, trying to get to necessary tubs, as they were called. They're not pictured in this image, but these tubs where people were supposed to relieve themselves. The smell of excrement was everywhere. Sometimes the necessary tubs tipped over. And then add in the smell of the smell of human beings in the state of fear. Do you know what that smells like? That sharp, pungent smell. People who have been in battle know it. This is part of the smell of bondage. Think of the soundtrack of this reality. Think of the shrieks of the terrified. Think of the groans of the dying. Think of the mass death that was faced every day when people died and were then taken up above deck and thrown overboard. Okay. Here are the tools of the trade. At the lower right, we have shackles, in which the left ankle of one person would be hooked to the right ankle of another. All men were shackled. Women and children, not usually, but if they dared to resist, they would be. They would at the same time be manacled. You see at the very top, one person's left wrist to one person's right wrist. That meant that those two people had to coordinate every step, or else the metal would cut into the flesh, as it usually did. You see on the left, here in the middle, on the right in the middle, you see thumb screws. Thumb screws, where if you turn that key, this would be used to crush the thumbs of people who had dared to be part of the resistance on board the slave ship. That's just an instrument of torture. That's the only purpose for that. And on the right, maybe the most ghastly instrument of all, called the speculum oris. Many people refused to eat on the slave ships. And this was absolutely unforgivable from the point of view of the captain. So they had to be forced to eat if they dared to refuse. So imagine those three prongs in a closed position. They would be forced down the throat of the resisting enslaved person. You turn the key on the end, it opens up the throat from the inside, and some kind of liquid gruel would be poured down that person's throat to try to keep him or her alive to the New World so that they could be sold and profits realized. And of course, here on the left, we have the cat o' nine tails, which was one of the main instruments of discipline on a slave ship. You can see the different parts, the different lashes are knotted to tear the skin, but I would also mention that some captains threaded wire through the leather in order to make them cut more efficiently. The lash was used in very gruesome and vivid ways in the aftermath of an uprising. And there were a lot of uprisings on these ships. They didn't usually succeed, but they were very common, recent scholarship has shown. There would then be spectacles of punishment. Spectacles of punishment in which those who led the rebellion would not only be flogged, they would have their body parts cut off and passed around among the enslaved people who were on deck and forced to watch. Dismemberment. The decks of the slave ships ran red with blood very frequently. Torture against those who dared to resist. So my conclusion for this part of the presentation is that the slave ship, as I said earlier, was defined by terror, defined by these instruments of terror, and it was itself an instrument of terror. That's at its essence. Okay, so let's talk now about how enslaved people responded to the slave trade. This is, folks, the only redeeming part of this awful story. Because those people on those ships fought back in every imaginable way that you can come up with. They never accepted the reality of enslavement. Now, here is actually a really interesting and more accurate depiction of what the lower deck of a vessel looked like. This was actually drawn by a slave ship captain in France, the vessel Marie Seraphique, 1770. What you can see in some of these blue sails are women birthing babies. Very common thing on the Middle Passage. But here, you can kind of see how the previous one, look at this. That's almost like an industrial production of bodies, is it not? This is much more realistic. This is what these bodies looked like, arms and legs akimbo. What were these people doing and thinking as they experienced all of this? They experienced the violence, they experienced the horror, they experienced the terror, but they fought back and they actually built community. The great African-American writer Ralph Ellison put this very succinctly. He said, "A people is more than the sum of their brutalization." A people is more than the sum of their brutalization. And what we find is that in these circumstances, people are cooperating and they are communicating, even though they're of different ethnic and national and language groups. They're finding common language. And one major part of their common language is resistance. Because when you stopped eating on a slave ship, refusing to eat, as many people did, you could actually describe the slave ship as the site of a 400-year hunger strike, despite the speculum oris. When you stopped eating, it didn't matter what language the people with you on that ship spoke. They understood what you were doing. They understood resistance. Resistance itself becomes a language. Hunger strikes. Insurrections. Really important. Just like this. This is a Spanish ship, circa 1755. What you can see is that every slave ship had something called a barricado. You see that structure built at midship. That's so the crew would have a place to retreat in order to fire down on the rebels if they managed to rise up. And as I said, they did manage to rise up very frequently. For a long time, it was believed that there were only about 50 revolts on slave ships. Now we know 1 out of every 10 voyages had major loss of life because of uprisings. And it's probably, folks, much higher than that. But that much we can prove at this point in the research. Sometimes the point of an insurrection was not to capture the ship. That might be surprising to you because many people didn't know how to sail the ship anyway. And we do find in the record ghost ships, literally ships sailing at sea with no one left alive on them. And it's pretty clear there had been an uprising and nobody knew how to sail the ship and they all just died. But another purpose for the insurrection, do you see people jumping overboard? Slave ship captains noted that sometimes the purpose of an uprising was a mass suicide, to go home to Guinea. So these are very important things to know. But the most astonishing thing about the slave trade, in my view, is the creativity that those people down below exercised under the most extreme circumstances. New relationships, new words, new grammar, new songs, new dances, new rituals, new cultural forms. And maybe the best example of this is what anthropologists call fictive kinship. People who were not biologically related to each other would start addressing each other in the terms of kinship, literally creating fictive relationships as if they were biologically related. A woman might tell a little boy or a girl, "That's your uncle." Everybody who's on the ship, every man is your uncle. Every woman on board the ship is your aunt. These fictive kinship designations would be carried ashore as part of this culture of resistance when they reached port. And there are fascinating examples of people referring to, "Yeah, my uncle, I came across on the slave ship with him. He's my uncle." These kinds of things went on. So, within this vessel of howling misery, out there in the middle of nowhere, there is new and defiant creativity below decks. And depending on how you look at this, right, the new culture that is being built on these ships, if you look at it from the point of view of West Africa, it is a Pan-African project in which many different peoples are coming together to form something new. If you look at it from the point of view of arrival in the Americas, it's the origins of African-American history. And I use that term in a hemispheric sense, not a national one. Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-North American. The things that are happening on the ship are part of cultural formation that is new. It's not reducible to anything that existed in West Africa, but it incorporates a lot of features of these West African cultures. Now, I want to submit to you that there is an awesome beauty in all of this. This talking below decks. This is actually a painting, a watercolor by a British naval officer after a Spanish slave ship had been captured in the 1840s, I think it was. Now, these people have been liberated, so the situation is different. But what are they doing? They're talking. They're conversing. They're trying to figure out what their lives are going to be. You get the same image from Alauda Equiano, who became the voice of the voiceless in giving an account of the Middle Passage when he was a 10 or 11-year-old boy. So to conclude, I said earlier, and let me repeat, the ghost ships are still sailing. They're sailing around the edge of our modern consciousness. They're this spectral type of presence in our lives. And this is because what these slave ships created, what they made possible, is not merely an atrocity or set of atrocities, not merely a regrettable part of our common past, but what many people are increasingly recognizing as a crime against humanity. And here's what's distinctive about a crime against humanity. A crime against humanity is something that affects an entire society over many generations. And that, folks, is what the slave trade has done. And we do live with its effects today. I'll just mention 4 of them. Discrimination, multi-generational poverty, deep structural inequality, and one that I think gets not nearly enough emphasis, premature death. The basic demographic rates of populations, black and white, are quite different. And if you want another image of how the past is linked to the present, let me show you this piece of political art by a West Coast American artist named David Thorne. What he's done is taken the image of the Brooks and superimposed on top of it the diagram of a super maximum prison in the United States. You don't see the bodies in the prison, but you see where the bodies of the slave ship or the descendants of the bodies of the slave ship will go. So in the United States, at least, and I'm sure in many other places, racialized incarceration is another way that the slave ships are still sailing. They're still sailing. Okay. I'll just conclude by saying we have a lot of work to do to repair this mess. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Now, before the two of us go into your book and your presentation, I would like to see whether there are questions or remarks from the audience first.
One of the last images where you could see below deck, I didn't see stairs. I saw the hole, but like they were thrown in, how?
There were ladders. Okay. Ladders which could be lifted up after people were thrown down. There were ladders. Yeah. The diagrams of these, it's hard to imagine, but the diagram of the lower deck is itself sanitized. It was actually much worse than even the powerful image of the abolitionist movement could create. And let me also mention, it was said that when you were on shore and the wind was blowing a certain direction off the water, you could smell a slave ship before you could see it. So one of the effects of people being thrown down below and locked away for, well, in bad weather, 24 hours a day. In good weather, 16 hours a day. It's something we have to think about. We've got to make it real.
Thanks for a very excellent presentation. My question was about the insurrections. Excuse me. About the insurrections, where you mentioned that until recently, the estimates or the ideas of how frequent they were was underestimated. And I'm curious, why do you think that was, and what kind of research enabled that to be corrected?
This was corrected by research done for the trans-Atlantic slave trade database. One of its architects, David Richardson, recently passed away, wrote an article about summarizing what had been discovered in this massive compilation of data. David Eltis and a team of scholars have built this. You can just type Transatlantic Slave Trade Database and go right there and start looking at all the numbers. You can call up all of the Dutch voyages if you like. So this is why we know now that the numbers were much greater. The problem is there is highly variable documentation among the different voyages. For some voyages, we know a lot about what happened. Those would be voyages in which the captain kept a detailed log or maybe a journal. But there are many voyages in which the only thing we know is the ship's name and maybe the captain's name and maybe the number of slaves who were on board. So if we are able to fill in a fuller profile of evidence for more of these voyages, I think the number of insurrections is going to go up. And this is, this is fascinating because this speaks to the political will of the enslaved, because not only were they chained, most of them, but the slave ship is designed to prevent resistance. Everything about it is designed to prevent resistance. And yet that political will could never be eliminated. It could be controlled under certain circumstances using violence and terror, but it could not be eliminated. So, you know, my sense is that the resistance was thorough, common, and the slave ship captains knew it. I mean, they understood all of this, and several of them left very detailed diaries and journals in which they explained all this.
What's your opinion about Governor DeSantis? He is saying to the schools in Florida that slavery was okay.
Yeah, we have a big war going on right now in the United States over which history will be taught. Now, I may be a bit biased, but I believe that the scholarship that has been done in the United States and in Brazil and in the Caribbean and in Europe on the slave system that I've been talking about here, I think this is the best body of scholarship produced anywhere in the world in the last 50 years. It is stunning how much we know about slavery now. But there remains this terrible gap between what the scholars know and what the general public knows, and increasingly what the general public doesn't want to know, right? Because look, tremendous progress has been made in raising these issues. You know, the history that I grew up with, growing up in the American South in the 1950s and early 1960s, that history was completely whitewashed. Black people were, quote, happy darkies. They loved slavery. Massa was very good to them. But that was totally challenged by the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, both of whom demanded a completely new kind of history. So you take the best of the work of the last 50 years, and that's what DeSantis is afraid of.
Can you combat that?
Sorry?
Can you fight it?
It's being fought. It's being fought as we speak. There are battles going on involving librarians, involving teachers. My daughter is a high school teacher. But she's in New York, which is a safe place, relatively. In Florida, she would be in danger for teaching the way that she teaches, right? So this is a battle that's going to be fought out. We don't know how it's going to go. And I'll just mention one more anecdote. In 1991, the first President, George Bush, decided that we needed new American history standards, that the American history that children were being taught was outdated. A friend of mine named Gary Nash, brilliant historian, and a team of people from the main professional organization, the Organization of American Historians, summarized the best research that had gone on over the previous 30 years and rewrote the American history standards. That proposal was submitted to the United States Senate, where it was defeated 99-1. This is just what historians believed and had discovered. Like, this wasn't some left-wing, version. It was just what historians had learned. And the senators were very honest in saying why they opposed it. Insufficiently patriotic. Which tells you that one of their main concerns in teaching American history is to make young men and women willing to go and die in foreign wars for the mythic history that they have learned. And that if you learn the truth, you may not feel quite the same way. So this battle has been going on for a long time. It will continue to go on for a long time. In the long term, I'm optimistic because the work, the scholarship that's been done is just extraordinary, and I think it will prevail. Very, very few. And what's really fascinating about this is that even the black sailors on board these ships, and there were quite a number of black sailors because black sailors didn't have very many jobs they could get. If an uprising broke out, they fought with the crew to put it down. So what this tells me, as I've said in the book, is that the slave ship captain had a very complex job of policing the line between the crew and the enslaved. And both were subject to a violent regime of punishment. Laura Equiano said, this is a little boy, and wrote this years later, but he said, not long after we were out at sea, the captain gave a fearful whipping to a white sailor, creating injuries that ultimately cost that sailor his life. And so Equiano said, if he's willing to do that to one of his own people, a white person, what will they do to me? So it's fascinating that captains would actually use violence against their crew to further intimidate the enslaved, showing I will be ruthless no matter who challenges my authority. But I did find that these slave ship captains, who were very tough characters and very learned in how to manage and control human beings, that they did successfully police that line. Now, when the voyages were over, completely different situation. And one of the most touching things that I discovered in my research was that sailors, European sailors, who arrive in a place like Jamaica or Brazil, Virginia, they're frequently sick at the end of the voyage because they've caught malaria on the West African coast. The captains are very glad that they're sick because they want them to go ashore so they don't have to pay their wages. These sick sailors were taken in by African women repeatedly in numerous places, and many of them were nursed back to health because many of these women knew herbal remedies to deal with malaria. And if those white sailors died, they were buried in the African graveyards. So this is kind of an extraordinary act of humanity. I mean, these African women knew who these sailors were. They were their prison guards. And yet they had the capacity to try to help them live. So on the ship, very limited cooperation, but off the ship, other things were possible.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful talk. One thing you didn't mention is that this isn't only history. Slavery still exists today, with maybe one difference being that now many enslaved peoples actually pay for their passage to get to places to where they're enslaved. So I thought maybe you would like to say something about that longer arc of history.
Yes, I'd be happy to, Lisa. Thank you. There's been a lot of work to show that there are probably more people, no, I'd say definitely more people, enslaved in the world economy today than there were at the peak of the African slave system. Now, they're not enslaved exactly the same way, and they do make up a much smaller percentage of the world's population, but there are millions of people. Kevin Bales, the sociologist, has suggested 28 million child laborers in India and Pakistan, rural workers effectively enslaved in Brazil, sex workers enslaved in Eastern Europe. And the common thread in all of these is that these are people who are held in violent, degrading working conditions by violence or the threat of violence. So there's this happy story of abolition and emancipation in which all right-thinking people came together and eliminated all that. But the truth is, the forms of exploitation changed. And they changed for black people in the American South, who went from being slaves to being sharecroppers and held in a kind of debt bondage that it took decades upon decades to escape. So I think it's fair to say that these issues of slavery are real. We do see them in some of these desperate bids to cross the Mediterranean to Europe. And as you know, we have a conference on that coming up this weekend at the International Institute of Social History, combining scholarship on maritime solidarity with activist work in the present. So I think this is a very contemporary issue, and I thank you for raising it.
Thank you. I'll come back to the audience. I'll ask a couple of questions myself, and you will get a second round of chances to ask or Marcus or questions or comment on his work. Marcus, you mentioned you called your own subject tough, horrific, almost unbearable, things like that. But you also said it is necessary, and I think that's true not just in a US context, but also in the Netherlands. A Dutch historian a month ago called enslaved workers kidnapped from Africa, and if you read Elsevier's Weekblad, you will notice that commentators there said that no, nobody was kidnapped by Dutch slavers. They decently paid for the slaves that they brought from Africa. And the horrific stories about the Middle Passage are necessary to combat that form of denial, to show that it's not decent if you pay at the start of this passage and are involved in this trade. And actually, contemporaries knew this. In the book, Marcus tells about one enslaved person, one crew member, and one captain, which are people who wrote autobiographies or similar documents, and they are therefore well known in the historiography. But you also did a large amount of archival work from merchant letters and logbooks of ships, piece together a more structural account of these three groups and the Middle Passage itself. And usually historians have the historical sensation when they work on this kind of material, and there are moments where you suddenly feel part of it, and that's what you're trying to convey. And I've seen the reaction of the audience, and I know that you have succeeded in conveying that this evening also. If it's not too personal, can you tell us something about the work in the archive and your historical experience there?
Yes, thank you, Lex. Let me begin my answer to that question by talking about the difficulty of taking the decision to write this book. There were two things that I got the idea for this book from talking with a man on death row, a political prisoner named Mumia Abu Jamal. We talked about, I was working on, as part of a movement to get him a new trial and get him off death row. He is off death row now, I'm happy to say, although still incarcerated. But we talked about the connection between race and terror. That race in the United States has frequently been an experience of terror. And it dawned on me in that moment that I could study the origins of that connection. But it took me several years before, I don't know, you might say I worked up the courage to undertake the book. And there were two questions that were on my mind. First of all, can you do moral justice to the subject? Because you write about a topic like this, I think you have an obligation to the people who suffered so extremely in these circumstances. Can you do them justice? And the second question was, is this a subject that you can bear to live with for several years? Because that's what it would take. I worked on the book for about 5 years. And eventually I came to think I didn't know if I could do justice to the people on those ships. You never know, but it was certainly worth trying. And with regard to living with the subject, if you want to do history from below, as I do, this is the ultimate challenge, to try to understand the experience on these ships. And whatever refracted suffering I might go through was nothing compared to the people who went through the original experience. So I should try it. I should try to write this book. And it was hard at every step of the way. There were moments in the archives when I broke down in tears, had to leave, just go outside, walk around. So it's tough, but it had to be tough. How could it be any other way if you have empathy for people who are on those ships? So I guess I think every book has a hidden emotional life, maybe an emotional origin and an emotional life, and this certainly has one. I received a lot of encouragement along the way.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's not easy to read the book, but if you haven't done so yet, strongly encourage you to do it and have this necessary sensation yourself. There was a question about solidarity of the crew with the enslaved, and you said that you had hardly come across instances of that, and you explained why that didn't happen. The other thing around in your book you describe happens. There are members of the cargo of slaves who take on jobs aboard ship, help sailing the ship, even fight other ships that are taking it. Can you explain that?
Yes, this is one of the interesting contradictions of the slave trade, because as I've said, the European sailors are frequently getting sick as they cross the Atlantic. This leads many slave ship captains to take African men from the lower deck and train them how to operate the ships. And this is seen, as many of these people, as an opportunity, because if you acquire the skill to sail one of these extraordinary contraptions called a European sailing ship, your likelihood of gaining freedom eventually is much, much greater. And this happened with Lauda Equiano. He would go on, he followed the crew members everywhere, trying to figure out what this, he thought this was some kind of a magical machine, trying to figure out how did they make it go, how did they make it stop, and what's this compass for, so he was unbelievably curious. He would become a sailor, and in the process of becoming a sailor, he would make money to buy his own freedom. So I think, and then this turns out to be a key issue in the sequel book that I wrote about the Amistad Rebellion, which was a successful uprising aboard a slave schooner in 1839. Turns out that group of people, all from Sierra Leone, who captured the vessel, the Amistad, they sailed it 1,600 miles north to the northern tip of Long Island before they were captured by the U.S. Navy and thrown in jail and charged with mutiny and piracy. How did they sail the ship? It had to be because some of them had training on board the vessel that they had made the passage from Sierra Leone to Havana, Cuba. So the knowledge that you gain could be part of your own liberation, and I think people had a sense of that.
Okay, let's have another round of questions from the audience. The one I saw before was the lady over there.
I have a quick question. Who was the creator of the tools? Who were the creators of the tools?
I'm sorry, who asked that? The tools? Very good question. They were metal workers in and around Liverpool, which was the probably the leading port of the slave trade in the 18th century. And I often ask myself, what is the consciousness of a worker who produces these things for the slave trade? I don't think I got a very good answer, but I did come across a remarkable moment in the history in which the cutlers, as those workers were called, of Sheffield, England, after hearing a lecture by Olaudah Equiano, who after he gained his own freedom became part of the abolitionist circuit and became one of the very few black voices of abolition in that period. The cutlers of Sheffield, England wrote a denunciation of the slave trade and said they wouldn't make those kinds of things anymore. So anyway, it was a big industry. It was a very big industry. Everything around Liverpool was kind of in the orbit of the slave trade. And Thomas Clarkson, the abolitionist who was actually much more important than Wilberforce, that image that we had of the shackles and the manacles he went around to the shops on the waterfront of Liverpool and bought these things and then had an artist draw them for this book. But he also interviewed sailors, including black sailors, about what their experience in the slave trade actually was. And this then led the merchants of Liverpool to try to kill Clarkson. They literally tried to kill him, and he had to go around with a bodyguard thereafter. So these instruments of terror are very important. And let me just mention one more thing about this. I wrote a poem about this called The Gun-Slave Cycle. One of the things that was very important to the slave trade was weapons. And these weapons would be sold by the European slave trader to usually a West African king in alliance with the slave trader. That person's army would then be taught how to use these weapons. They would go into the interior, capture people, bring them back to the coast. So guns would beget slaves, which would beget more guns. When I was visiting Mumia Abu Jamal once, he was handcuffed. And I noticed that the handcuffs were made by Smith & Wesson, the largest manufacturer of handguns, at that time at least. I don't know if it's still true. So the gun-slave cycle is still alive. Thank you for the question. There was someone in the back there. Two more people. We'll come to you.
Thank you, and thanks for the very important talk and your very valuable books. You referred to the Holocaust as well as another horror perpetrated. And it made me think of a book by the Holocaust scholar Raoul Hilberg, Perpetrators, Victims, and Bystanders, as the main categories involved. You've talked about the perpetrators and the victims, but the bystanders are often the largest group. Could you talk about them, or would you think this category appropriate for the slave trade and slavery as well?
I didn't use these categories in my book, but I do recognize they can have value because what abolitionists wanted to do was turn bystanders into supporters of a movement, right? So they wanted to reach people, and here's the thing that shocked me. 1787. A group of 12 men, including Clarkson, and mostly Quakers who were opposed to slavery, met in London to form a society to effect the abolition of the slave trade. Now, imagine what they were up against. In 5 years, they basically had a national consensus that the slave trade should be abolished. It's shocking how quickly people left being bystanders and became supporters of abolitionism. Now, it took another 15 years for abolition to take place because of the French Revolutionary Wars. And Britain wasn't going to give up an advantage in the slave trade during the period when they were battling their archenemy, France. But I do recognize the value of this, and yeah, there were a lot of bystanders. The people who thought that slavery was a completely natural institution in the 17th, 18th, and well into the 19th century, those numbers of people were very, very large in number. And that's why this man that Lex mentioned, Benjamin Lay, the radical Quaker abolitionist, is so important because he became an abolitionist in 1718, 2 full generations before an anti-slavery movement developed. And his fellow Quakers at that time owned a lot of slaves. So he was determined that they were not going to be bystanders. They were not going to be participants if there was anything he could do to stop it. So he would do things like sprinkle fake blood on the heads of the slave owners. And boy, were the slave owners furious. They disowned him from the Quaker faith, which was very painful for him. But this issue of how do you attack the view that slavery is acceptable, that slavery is natural, that slavery is something that might help me to get rich someday. How do you go after that? That was a very big question. Embedded in your question was the political question of how the abolitionists were going to do this. And they did it pretty quickly, at least with regard to the slave trade. But then they made the erroneous assumption that if you abolish the slave trade, slavery would die, and clearly it did not. And it lived for a long time after the abolition. There were 2 people in the back middle.
You shortly touched upon how slave traders kind of exhausted the coastal regions and later on moved further inland. I was wondering if you could touch upon how African societies dealt with slave trade and reacted to this exhaustion of people.
Yeah, that's a very big and very complex question, and I'm really not trained as an African historian, so there may be people here who know better than I. But you have to remember that during the era of the Atlantic slave trade, when these millions of people are being pumped out into the Atlantic economy, there are also millions who are being transported to the north, to the Middle East. So one of the results of these 2 slave trades is that the youngest and most productive members of these West African societies were taken overseas or taken to North Africa or the Middle East. It's kind of impossible to imagine how much wealth was lost from the loss of those bodies and their capacity. So Walter Rodney has written a great book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I would strongly recommend it to you if you don't know. But his argument is that the slave trade transformed African societies and made them more vulnerable to all kinds of outside interference. It distorted their shape. It caused the loss of cultural memory and how to produce certain things. So the slave trade was, even though some individual coastal kingdoms grew to great wealth and power, for most people in West Africa, it was just an unmitigated disaster. And I don't think they've recovered from it yet either. There was a woman in the back row right behind the young man who just asked the question.
Yes, oh, that's loud. My question is that we're talking about the slave ships, right? And here in Amsterdam, we have a replica of one of the VOC ships, so the Dutch East Indian Trading Company. So my question is basically, what is your opinion and observation on showing off this boat every day here in Amsterdam, and that a lot of people glorify it in terms of the golden age of Amsterdam and brought so much wealth to the city? However, other people see it and have more this remembrance of the slaves that were maybe in there or not.
I think such an object as a European tall ship like that could be a wonderful thing for teaching and debate, if you're willing to tell the truth about it. Now, the people who want to discuss its glories are usually not willing to tell the truth about it. What kinds of exploitation did those ships make possible, right? What did those ships do in the East Indies and the West Indies? What did they create? Those would be really important questions to ask, right? And they're perfectly important and legitimate questions. The ship itself could be put to many different uses. But I would think that it could be a very positive thing. I would want, for example, to see what the descendants of enslaved people in Suriname had to say about it. What do they think about that ship and what it wrought? Right. So yeah. Let's open up the discussion. You know, I've always loved Dutch art of the 17th century. That golden age was made possible by what those ships did. And did you ever notice in the art of that period how many of the paintings have maps on the walls? And have you ever noticed that a lot of those maps feature Africa? So there's a hidden history there too. Let's tell the truth about that as well in the sources of wealth internationally.
Ik ga het gewoon in Dutch, omdat ik kom namelijk uit een Nederlandse kolonie vanaf. Dus kunt u het vertalen? Ja, ja. Omdat ik ook Engels ook en dat kan, maar ik ga het met opzetten, omdat het ook een koloniale taal is voor mij. Bij mij. My question, dus mijn vraag luidt. U heeft er onderzoek gedaan als historicus, wetenschapper, betreffende waar de slaven vandaan kwamen, dus tot slaafgemaakte waar ze vandaan kwamen. Wij, zwarte, waar mijn voorouders, waar ik nu, die hier nu sta, we zitten met één vraag. En die vraag is, waar komen mijn voorouders vandaan? Want iedereen zegt het in. Er is geen dossier hiervan, maar er is wel een dossier waar ze vandaan komen. Dus mijn vraag luidt, waar komen al die slaven, die miljoenen? Het zijn geen 10 of 20, want heel Zuid-Amerika, alleen in Colombia heb je 10 miljoen zwarte. Niet alleen in Brazilië, want Colombia ben ik geweest, ik ben in Uruguay geweest, ik ben in Argentinië. Daar heeft men alle zwarte afgemaakt. En die zwarte lijden nog steeds in Zuid-Amerika. Nog erger dan in Amerika, hoe men daar met de zwarte. Maar mijn vraag is, waar is het dossier waar alle slaven die tot slaaf gemaakt zijn, waar ligt dat dossier? Want niemand doet, alle historicus doet geen enkele onderzoek daarna. Maar wel waar ze vandaan komen. Dat was mijn vraag.
The question is posed in Dutch as to signify the Dutch colony Suriname, where the gentleman posing the question is from, and he mentioned that there are many blacks in Latin America, and he asked where the sources are where these people come from.
There has been extraordinary new work in Afro-Latin American history over the past 20 years. In fact, a colleague of mine at the University of Pittsburgh, Reed Andrews, has written very important books on black people in Argentina, black people in Ecuador, and black people in Brazil. And of course, the scholarship produced in Brazil about slavery is of very high quality, some of the best in the world. So the sources that are being used to study the history of black people in Latin America are, for example, the Archive of the Indies in Sevilla, in Spain, many local records in Cuba. There are outstanding works on Cuban slavery being done, one of them by a close friend of mine, Alejandro de la Fuente, called A Nation for All, Race in Cuba. And if you like, I can give you some references, but I'm happy to say this subject of the black history of Latin America has really taken off in recent years. I think it's a very creative field, and there is extremely important work being done. Did you have a comment on that?
There's no international databases everywhere. We have a little bit up there in that country.
That's right.
There's no international database that people can see quickly and find out quickly information. You have to do a lot of stuff to find.
That is true. And I think there probably will be linkages of the transatlantic slave trade database to other kinds of databases in the future. But that database will tell you specifically which areas of West Africa people are coming from. And you can learn a lot about the ethnicity of people who were going, for example, to Cuba or to Brazil or to Virginia, because traders specialized in certain routes. For example, Igbo people in what is presently Nigeria, many of them will end up in Virginia, for example. Many people from Sierra Leone will end up in Cuba. Many people from Congo and Angola will end up in Brazil. So again, you're right. A lot more linkage needs to take place, but I think there are some movements in this direction.
Two people have been signifying that they want to pose a question. The lady over there in front of the pillar and the gentleman over here. And I'm sorry, I want to ask a question, or is that
lady?
The lady first.
Zal ik hem pakken? Ja. Thanks for all the explanation. I have two questions. In around 1630, the city of Amsterdam, the rulers here, the burgemeesters, they made an act in which they wrote, "We dislike slavery." They clearly made a statement like that. Is that exceptional, or what is it? How did other cities or governors or Liverpool or whatever made they a statement like that, or is it something typical of Amsterdam? And the reason why I'm telling it also is because of the ship bij het scheepvaarthuis. It's not a slavery ship, it's a trading ship. So is trade the same as slavery? It's the same question, I think the burgemeesters.
Okay. Yeah, I do not know about this proclamation against slavery. I would say that it's unusual. I would say that there were slave traders in Amsterdam after that, so it certainly was not a universal sentiment. No. But you do find in places that, sometimes surprising places, that there will be expressions of opposition. But the economic importance of the slave trade tends to steamroller the opposition, and that the money behind the trade will override those kinds of statements very frequently. So that's one point. In terms of slave ship versus trading ship, a slave ship was a trading ship, and a great many vessels that were engaged in other kinds of trade also ended up in the slave trade. And that practically any kind of vessel could be in the slave trade. So I would not make such a hard and fast distinction, because if that particular ship wasn't involved in the slave trade, there are a whole lot more just like it that were. So I think we've got to admit that slave trade is part of entire trading networks and empires. There's a lot of circulation of knowledge and technology.
And the other question that I have is, because I'm always looking for something good from slave trade, did people discover in Africa ways like medicines or psychedelics or something to keep people quiet, keep them better? Was that an improvement in the way of how Europeans were thinking?
You know, the use of drugs in the slave trade was primarily later in the 19th century, drugging Indian laborers who were being brought to the West Indies to replace the emancipated West Africans. But if you want to look for something positive, out of all of this massive pain, this unbelievable suffering, came global black music. No, really. Think about it. I mean, think about blues, jazz, soul. Think about the kinds of music that developed in order to try to express this pain, right? I mean, you can't imagine the world without one of the many, many implications of the African slave trade. And the existence of that music is itself a declaration of triumph, of resistance. That despite all this, we are still here, we are still creative, and we're creating the world's soundtrack.
First of all, thank you very much for providing us with the lecture. And I really like the metaphor on the ghost slave ships that are still there and that the effects are still being felt. And you ended on a note saying that we have to repair the atrocities. And my first question is actually, what do you think is like the greatest inhibiting factor in Western society making amends with itself and like make the repairments, and how would you concretize these repairments?
Okay, this is a very big and complex issue. How the repair should happen. I don't pretend to be a representative of that movement. I said in the book, and I'll say again, that the people who are the descendants of the victims of the slave trade must lead a movement demanding what must be done to repair the situation. And I am happy to tell you that the reparations movement in the United States, and I think in other parts of the world too, has grown a great deal over the last 10 years. Actually, there are, Evanston, Illinois, a city, has its own reparations project now. It's primarily to compensate black people who have lived in that city for a long time and who suffered serious discrimination in housing. So it's not just linked to exploitation under slavery, it's linked to some more contemporary concerns, which are, of course, linked. But if you want to know more about the many different forms that reparations can take. It's much more complex than simply handing over money to descendants. There are a lot of proposals for massive investment in poor neighborhoods, which would actually raise the quality of life for everyone in those kinds of places and cities. So there are just very many ways to go around about it. But I do believe there's a stage before reparations that we need to get to, and that is recognition. We have to recognize that this happened. We have to get beyond the denial, and that's hard. That's really hard. A tremendous amount of energy in the United States, certainly, and I think most everywhere else, is put into pretending that this never happened. And this was the source of the hate mail, right? Why do you want to go bringing this up? You know, so there's a very big kind of battle to be waged for the historical truth. And as this gentleman asked about before, that battle is now going on in the public schools of what people will be allowed to teach. But I do think some progress is being made. And there is a book on this subject by a scholar at Duke University named Sandy Darity, D-A-R-I-T-Y, if you want to learn about the range of reparation arguments.
Thank you for all of these questions and suggestions. I apologize if I overlooked your hand, but I do think it's time to wrap up the evening with drinks. Some of you will be able to pose your questions to Marcus while you each have a drink. Thank you, Marcus, for a wonderful book and a wonderful presentation.